April 17, 1943. Kriegsmarine testing facility, Gdynia, Poland. The steel pressure chamber trembled on its mountings as Kapitän-Leutnant Friedrich Steinhoff watched the pressure gauge climb past 200 meters equivalent depth. Inside the chamber sat a single depth charge, recovered 3 weeks earlier from a downed British Sunderland flying boat off the Norwegian coast. "This cannot be correct," he muttered to his assistant, Oberleutnant Werner Krauss. "Check the calculations again." Krauss consulted his clipboard, rechecking figures that had been verified a dozen times already. "The mathematics are accurate, Herr Kapitän-Leutnant. The explosive compound tests at 50% greater blast yield than trinitrotoluene." Through the observation port, Steinhoff could see the depth charge resting in its steel cradle, innocuous in appearance, devastating in implication. The casing bore British markings, Mark 9 aerial depth bomb, with a manufacturing date stamp from February 1943. The weapon measured barely over 2 feet long, weighed approximately 200 pounds, and contained an explosive compound that German ordnance experts had initially dismissed as impossible to manufacture in operational quantities. What neither Steinhoff nor his team yet understood was that this single captured weapon would explain a statistical catastrophe that had been destroying Grand Admiral Karl Donitz's submarine force at unprecedented rates, a hemorrhaging of boats and men that threatened to lose Germany the Battle of the Atlantic within months. The mathematical certainty of German defeat was being written not in naval tactics but in chemical formulas that German science had explored theoretically but abandoned as impractical for mass production. The psychological transformation had begun. On that freezing April morning in Gdynia, German engineers were about to discover that their enemies possessed not merely superior numbers or better tactics, but fundamentally more powerful weapons based on explosive chemistry that rendered German depth charges obsolete by comparison. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon on Steinhoff's workbench had been recovered under circumstances that typified the desperate reality of German anti-submarine warfare in 1943. On March 28th, a Royal Air Force Sunderland flying boat from 201 Squadron, piloted by Flight Lieutenant James Thompson, had been patrolling Norwegian coastal waters when German fighters intercepted it near Stavanger. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. The Sunderland's rear gunner, Sergeant Peter Walsh, managed to damage one Messerschmitt Bf 109 before cannon fire tore through the flying boat's starboard wing. Thompson ditched the aircraft in relatively calm seas. The crew of 10 survived the crash and managed to deploy their life raft before the Sunderland sank in approximately 200 feet of water. German patrol boats rescued the crew within 3 hours, taking them prisoner and transporting them to Stavanger for interrogation. But the Kriegsmarine's interest focused not on the aircrew, but on the wreckage itself. Luftwaffe intelligence had noted that British anti-submarine aircraft were achieving unprecedented success rates against U-boats, sinking submarines with what appeared to be single-depth bomb hits at ranges and depths that should have required multiple attacks. German naval intelligence theorized that the British had developed improved fusing mechanisms or better attack tactics. The truth, as Steinhoff would soon discover, was far more troubling. The Sunderland had been carrying 6 Mark 9 depth bombs when it crashed. German salvage divers recovered 4 intact weapons from the wreckage over a period of 2 weeks, working in frigid water at depths that tested their equipment and endurance. 2 additional bombs had apparently detonated on impact or been lost in deeper water. The recovered weapons were carefully transported to the testing facility at Gdynia, where the Kriegsmarine maintained its most sophisticated explosive research laboratories. Admiral Theodor Kranke, commanding German naval forces in Norway, had personally ordered the depth bombs delivered to Steinhoff's team with instructions to determine exactly what capabilities the British weapons possessed and whether German depth charges required immediate upgrading. Steinhoff assembled Germany's top naval ordnance specialists for what would become known as the Gdynia Technical Working Group. Their task was to disassemble the British weapons, analyze their explosive composition, assess their lethality compared to German depth charges, and determine whether Germany could replicate or counter whatever advantage the British had achieved. The first examination, conducted on April 2, 1943, revealed the Mark IX's basic construction. The weapon used a teardrop-shaped casing, streamlined for stable underwater descent. This represented an improvement over the cylindrical German depth charges, but was not revolutionary. British engineers had simply applied better hydrodynamic principles to reduce wobble during the weapon's fall through water. More interesting was the fusing mechanism. The Mark IX employed a hydrostatic fuse that could be preset for depths up to 600 feet, with later variants reaching 1,000 feet. German depth charges typically maxed out at 300 feet, though some experimental models reached 400 feet. This depth advantage was significant but not decisive, as most U-boat kills occurred at shallower depths where submarines were more vulnerable. But when Steinhoff's team carefully opened the weapon's casing and examined the explosive filler, their assumptions shattered completely. The compound inside was not trinitrotoluene, the standard explosive used by all major navies since World War I. Instead, the British had filled their depth bomb with a granular mixture that initial chemical analysis suggested contained multiple components, including aluminum powder. Dr. Hans Trautmann, a civilian chemist seconded to the Kriegsmarine from IG Farben's explosives division, supervised the detailed analysis. His team extracted small samples of the explosive compound and conducted a series of tests over 3 days, from April 5 through April 8, 1943. The results were unequivocal and deeply disturbing. The British explosive compound consisted of approximately 42% RDX, a cyclotrimethylenitronitromine compound that German scientists knew theoretically as hexogen. 40% trinitrotoluene served as a stabilizing matrix. 18% powdered aluminum enhanced the explosive effect, particularly in underwater detonations. Small amounts of wax acted as a desensitizing agent, making the compound safe to handle despite its tremendous power. The British called it Torpex, short for torpedo explosive, though its applications extended far beyond torpedoes to include naval mines, aerial depth bombs, and even strategic bombing ordnance. Trautmann's report, completed on April 10th and classified as most secret, stated with scientific precision what the numbers revealed. Torpex delivered approximately 50% greater explosive force than an equivalent weight of trinitrotoluene. In underwater applications, the aluminum component extended the duration of the explosive pulse, dramatically increasing destructive effect against submarine pressure hulls. The implications were devastating. A 200-pound British depth bomb filled with Torpex delivered the explosive punch of a 300-pound German depth charge filled with trinitrotoluene. British aircraft could carry more weapons per sortie while delivering greater cumulative explosive power. British surface escorts could achieve lethal detonations at greater distances from their targets. Every tactical calculation that German U-boat commanders had memorized during training was suddenly obsolete. The safety margin they had relied upon, the distance at which depth charge explosions could be survived, had shrunk by a third without German naval command, understanding why casualty rates were climbing so precipitously. Steinhoff convened the first formal meeting of the Gdynia Working Group on April 13, 1943. Representatives from the Kriegsmarine's technical divisions attended, along with chemists from Germany's major industrial firms and ordnance specialists from submarine construction yards. The mood in the conference room at the Gdynia naval base was somber. Steinhoff began his presentation with a statement that would later be recorded in the minutes, captured by Allied investigators after the war. We must report that British anti-submarine weapons have achieved a significant advantage in explosive power. The compound designated Torpex represents approximately 1.5 times the destructive force of our current depth charge fillers. This advantage manifests most critically in underwater detonation scenarios, where the extended pressure pulse inflicts damage at ranges we previously considered safe. The presentation detailed Torpex's chemical composition and the sophisticated manufacturing process required to produce it in quantity. RDX had been discovered in 1899 by German chemist Georg Friedrich Henning, working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. But RDX's extraordinary sensitivity to shock and its expensive production process had discouraged military applications. Germany had explored RDX-based explosives during the 1920s and 30s, Steinhoff explained, but concluded that the compound was too costly and too dangerous for widespread military use. German ordnance experts had decided that trinitrotoluene offered the best balance of power, stability, cost, and manufacturing simplicity. The British, suffering under years of U-boat blockade and desperate for any advantage in anti-submarine warfare, had made a different calculation. They had invested in RDX production despite the costs, accepting the technical challenges in exchange for weapons that could kill submarines at greater range. More critically, British scientists had solved the sensitivity problem through careful formulation. By mixing RDX with trinitrotoluene and adding wax desensitizers, they had created a stable compound that could be safely manufactured, transported, and handled. The addition of aluminum powder exploited a phenomenon that German researchers had studied, but not successfully weaponized at scale. The aluminum reacted with free oxygen released during the underwater explosion, extending the pressure pulse and converting more of the explosive energy into sustained crushing force against submarine hulls. Kapitänleutnant Gerhard Poppenberg, representing the submarine command staff, interrupted Steinhoff's presentation with a question that reflected the dawning horror in the room. How long have the British been deploying these weapons operationally? Steinhoff consulted his notes. Our best intelligence indicates Torpex entered service in late 1942. Aerial depth bombs using this compound were deployed to Royal Air Force Coastal Command squadrons, beginning in January or February 1943. Production has accelerated dramatically, suggesting British industry has mastered large-scale synthesis. We estimate current production at several thousand weapons per month. The timing explained everything. German U-boat losses had begun climbing sharply in late 1942, and had become catastrophic by March 1943. In that single month, German submarines sank over 100 merchant ships, but at the cost of 12 U-boats lost. The exchange rate, once heavily in Germany's favour, had deteriorated to unsustainable levels. May 1943 would prove even worse, with 41 U-boats destroyed in what would become known among submariners as Black May. But the Germans attending the Gdynia conference in mid-April did not yet know that catastrophe was imminent. They only knew that British depth charges had become far more lethal than German defensive calculations anticipated. The working group reached several conclusions that were documented in reports later captured by Allied technical intelligence teams. First, Germany could not replicate Torpex production in operationally significant quantities before 1944 at the earliest. The RDX synthesis process required specialized chemical plants, pure reagents that were increasingly scarce due to Allied blockade, and manufacturing expertise that German industry would need months to develop. The most efficient RDX production method, developed by British scientists at the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, used a continuous flow process that German batch production techniques could not match. Even a crash program to build RDX production facilities would take 9 to 12 months before output reached militarily useful levels. Second, Germany lacked access to key materials in sufficient quantities. Aluminum powder of the required fineness was in short supply, as German aluminum production was already stretched thin, supporting aircraft manufacturing. The specialized waxes used as desensitizers were petroleum derivatives that Germany could not easily synthesize, given the chronic fuel shortages that plagued the Third Reich from 1942 onward. Third, and most troubling, the British and Americans almost certainly possessed even more advanced explosives beyond what the Gdynia team had analyzed. If Torpex represented British explosive technology from 1942, Allied laboratories in 1943 were likely developing second-generation compounds that would render even Torpex obsolete. The technological race was not merely lost, it was unwinnable given Germany's deteriorating industrial capacity, shrinking resource base, and the Allied strategic bombing campaign that was systematically destroying German chemical plants. Admiral Karl Donitz absorbed these briefings with growing recognition of the catastrophe facing his U-boat command. His headquarters, which had relocated from Lorient to Berlin in early 1943 after Allied air raids had made French coastal bases increasingly vulnerable, maintained detailed statistical analysis of every patrol, every engagement, every loss. The numbers told a story more brutal than any tactical assessment. In January 1943, German U-boats sank 37 merchant ships while losing 7 submarines. In February, 34 merchant ships sank at a cost of 17 U-boats. March saw 82 merchant ships destroyed, but 12 U-boats lost. The trend was clear and accelerating. Korvettenkapitan Eberhard Gott, Donitz's operations chief, who had been promoted to Konteradmiral in March 1943, maintained plots showing where and how U-boats were being destroyed. The data revealed a disturbing pattern. Aircraft kills were increasing faster than surface ship kills, despite U-boats spending more time submerged to avoid air attack. When U-boats were caught on the surface by aircraft, the results were increasingly lethal. Single bomb hits that should have caused damage requiring repair were instead sinking boats outright. Submarines that previously might have survived depth charge attacks through skilled evasive maneuvers were being destroyed by attacks that seemed no different in execution than previous encounters. The explanation, Steinhoff's team had now confirmed, was that British weapons had become 50% more powerful without changing their appearance or delivery methods. German submarine captains had been calculating safe distances from explosions based on trinitrotoluene equivalents, but the weapons detonating around them were torpex, with kill radii a third larger than their training had prepared them for. The meeting at Gdynia broke up with clear but hopeless instructions. German industry would begin crash programs to synthesize RDX and develop torpex equivalents. In the meantime, U-boat tactics would be modified to account for the increased lethality of Allied depth weapons. Submarines would be ordered to dive deeper and evade more aggressively when under attack, but everyone in that room understood the mathematics. If a trinitrotoluene depth charge had a lethal radius of approximately 10 feet and a disabling radius of approximately 30 feet, the corresponding torpex weapon had a lethal radius of 15 feet and a disabling radius of 45 feet. The ocean had become 1/3 less safe for every German submarine operating in contested waters. The journey toward this revelation had actually begun years earlier, in laboratories far from the killing grounds of the Atlantic. In 1899, German chemist Georg Friedrich Henning had first synthesized hexogen while researching new explosives for military and civilian applications. The compound showed remarkable stability for such a powerful explosive and would later serve as the reference standard by which other military explosives were judged for sensitivity. But hexogen's production costs were prohibitive. The synthesis required nitric acid, formaldehyde, and ammonia, combined through a complex process that generated dangerous waste products. Yields were low. The final product, while stable once properly formulated, was extremely sensitive during intermediate production stages. German military planners in the 1920s, facing severe economic constraints imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, concluded that hexogen was too expensive for routine military applications. Trinitrotoluene, developed in 1863 and refined through decades of industrial production, offered adequate explosive power at a fraction of the cost. Germany reserved its limited hexogen production for specialized applications like torpedo warheads, where the extra power justified the extra expense. British scientists reached different conclusions. The Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, established in 1696 and by the 1930s the centre of British explosives research, had been investigating more powerful explosives since World War I. The carnage of that conflict, particularly the stalemate of trench warfare, had convinced British military planners that future wars would require weapons of unprecedented destructive power. In the 1930s, researchers at Woolwich mixed hexogen, which they designated RDX for Research Department Explosive or possibly Royal Demolition Explosive. Sources disagree, with trinitrotoluene and beeswax, to create Composition B. This mixture provided 30 to 40% greater explosive power than trinitrotoluene alone, while being significantly less sensitive to shock and impact. The beeswax acted as a phlegmatizing agent, coating the RDX crystals and preventing them from friction ignition during handling. Later formulations replaced beeswax with paraffin wax and added calcium chloride as a moisture absorber to prevent the production of hydrogen gas under humid storage conditions. Composition B found immediate application in Royal Air Force bombs and Royal Navy torpedo warheads. but British scientists recognized that underwater explosions required different optimization than airburst weapons. Water's incompressibility meant that explosive pressure waves propagated differently than in air, and chemical formulations could be adjusted to exploit this phenomenon. Enter Dr. Frederick Augustus Abel, and later researchers who developed what would become Torpex. The breakthrough insight was adding aluminum powder to the RDX trinitrotoluene mixture. Although both RDX and trinitrotoluene have negative oxygen balance, meaning they release free oxygen during detonation, the superheated aluminum contributed primarily by extending the expansion time of the explosive product gases. In an underwater explosion, this extended pulse was devastating. The initial shock wave from the detonation traveled through water at approximately 4,900 feet per second, far faster than sound travels through air. This shock wave struck the submarine's hull with tremendous force, but dissipated quickly with distance. The secondary effect, the bubble of hot gases produced by the explosion, underwent violent oscillations as water pressure crushed the bubble, which then re-expanded, which then compressed again. These oscillations created additional pressure pulses that, while weaker than the initial shock wave, lasted much longer. The aluminum component enhanced these secondary pulses, extending their duration and increasing total energy delivered to the target. For a submerged submarine, this meant that Torpex depth charges were lethal at greater distances and more likely to cause catastrophic structural failure rather than merely damaging equipment. German submarine pressure hulls, designed to resist steady external pressure from depth and the sharp shock of nearby TNT explosions, faced a hybrid threat that combined both characteristics in ways German engineers had not anticipated. The first Torpex production began at British facilities in 1941, but the quantities were limited. The Royal Gunpowder Factory at Waltham Abbey, northeast of London, had developed the formulation and conducted initial production trials. But scaling up to war production levels required solving numerous technical challenges. RDX synthesis generated highly acidic waste products that corroded production equipment. The mixing process, combining RDX with trinitrotoluene and aluminum powder, required careful temperature control to prevent premature detonation. The final product had to be tested batch by batch to ensure consistent quality, as variations in particle size or mixing ratios could dramatically affect both safety and performance. By late 1942, British industry had mastered these challenges. Production accelerated dramatically as additional factories came online and processes were refined. The United States, entering the war in December 1941, contributed industrial capacity that dwarfed Britain's capabilities. The Holston Ordnance Works, constructed near Kingsport, Tennessee, by Tennessee Eastman, a subsidiary of Eastman Kodak, would eventually produce 90% of the RDX used by American forces and 10% of British requirements. The facility began production in May 1943, though planning and construction had started in 1942. At peak production, Holston would produce approximately 700 tons of RDX-rich Composition B daily, a staggering output that German industry could never hope to match. American production capacity changed everything. The Holston facility would eventually produce more explosive in a single month than Germany's entire chemical industry could synthesize in a year. This industrial disparity, more than any tactical innovation, would determine the outcome of the Atlantic campaign. But in April 1943, as Steinhoff's team concluded their analysis in Gdynia, the full scale of Allied explosive production remained unknown to German intelligence. What was known, with terrifying clarity, was that British depth charges had become lethal at ranges German submarine hulls could not withstand. The safety margins that had allowed experienced commanders to survive depth charge attacks through 1942 had vanished. Every U-boat crew preparing for patrol in spring 1943 was sailing into waters where the weapons hunting them had become one-third more deadly without their knowledge. The ocean floor of the Atlantic was about to become littered with steel coffins, their crews killed by explosive chemistry they never understood until the moment of their deaths. The climactic crisis came in May 1943, a month that would forever be known among German submariners as Black May. The statistical catastrophe began in the final days of April, and accelerated through the first weeks of May with a brutality that shocked even hardened naval commanders who had witnessed years of savage combat. Convoy ONS-5, departing Liverpool on April 22nd with 43 merchant ships protected by 16 escorts, would become the crucible where the new reality revealed itself with undeniable clarity. Approximately 30 U-boats from 3 wolfpacks, designated groups Star, Pink, and Spect, were vectored toward the convoy by U-boat headquarters in Berlin. The resulting battle raged from April 28th through May 6th, covering hundreds of miles of North Atlantic waters. The German submarines managed to sink 12 to 13 merchant ships, a tactical success by previous standards. But the cost shattered every calculation that had governed U-boat operations since the war began. 6 U-boats were destroyed outright. Another 5 to 7 sustained damage so severe they had to abort their patrols and limp back to French bases. The exchange rate, for the first time in a major convoy battle, approached parity. German submarines were being destroyed almost as fast as they sank merchant vessels. Oberleutnant zur See Herbert Werner, serving as first watch officer aboard U-230, experienced the new lethality firsthand during operations against ONS-5. His submarine had successfully penetrated the escort screen on the night of May 4th, firing torpedoes that struck 2 merchant ships. Werner watched through the periscope as the vessels erupted in flames, their hulls breaking apart under the explosive force of the torpedoes. It was the last moment of triumph U-230 would experience on that patrol. Within minutes of the attack, ASDIC-equipped escorts converged on their position. Werner's commanding officer, Kapitänleutnant Paul Siegmann, ordered a crash dive to 200 meters. The boat descended into the depths, rigged for silent running, all non-essential systems shut down. The crew waited in darkness, broken only by emergency lighting, their breathing shallow to conserve oxygen. The first depth charges began falling within 7 minutes. Werner would later describe the attacks in his memoir, Iron Coffins, published in 1969 after he had immigrated to America and become a United States citizen. The explosions came with a violence we had not experienced in previous attacks. The boat was lifted bodily, thrown sideways, slammed downward. Paint and cork insulation rained from the overhead. Electrical panels sparked. Men were hurled against bulkheads with bone-breaking force. Werner's description captured a phenomenon that German submarine crews across the Atlantic were experiencing simultaneously. The depth charges detonating around them in May 1943 were no longer the weapons they had trained against. These were Torpex-filled weapons with kill radii that extended beyond the safe distances German tactical doctrine prescribed. U-230 endured 14 hours of continuous attack. 197 depth charges were counted by the crew, who tracked each explosion with grim precision. Several detonated close enough that the submarine's pressure hull deformed visibly, steel plates flexing inward with groaning metallic protests. Welds cracked, seams wept. High-pressure air lines ruptured, filling compartments with deafening hisses. Yet U-230 survived. Siegmann's skill, the crew's discipline, and considerable luck combined to bring the boat through. When they finally surfaced after 21 hours submerged, the air inside the submarine had become so foul that several men collapsed immediately upon reaching the conning tower, their lungs desperate for clean ocean air. Other boats were not so fortunate. U-192, commanded by Oberleutnant zur See Werner Happe, was detected by escorts from ONS-5 on May 6th. The submarine dove deep, attempting to evade, but the destroyers maintained solid ASDIC contact hour after hour. The depth charge attacks began at 1400 hours and continued through the afternoon and into evening. By 2100 hours, U-192 had sustained catastrophic damage. The pressure hull had cracked in multiple locations. Seawater flooded the aft torpedo room and the engine compartments. The batteries, contaminated by salt water, began generating chlorine gas that spread through the boat. Happe had no choice. He surfaced to surrender. The destroyers Viscount and Vidette rescued 32 survivors. 15 men had died in the attacks or drowned during the evacuation. Among the rescued was Maschinenmat Heinz Jaeger, who spent 18 months in Allied prisoner-of-war camps before repatriation in 1945. His interrogation, conducted at Fort Hunt, Virginia, designated P.O. Box 1142, provided Allied technical intelligence with valuable information about German understanding of Allied depth charge effectiveness. "We knew something had changed," Jaeger told his interrogators in June 1943. "The attacks in May were different from attacks we had survived in late 1942. The explosions seemed to reach further. Charges that detonated at distances we thought safe still caused severe damage." Our commanding officer said after one attack that either the British had developed larger depth charges or their explosives had become more powerful. "We did not know which until we surrendered and saw the weapons that had hunted us." Jaeger's testimony confirmed what Steinhoff's team in Gdynia had discovered through technical analysis. German submarine crews were experiencing the effects of torpex without understanding the cause. They knew Allied weapons had become more lethal. They did not know that the explosive chemistry filling those weapons had been fundamentally transformed. The pattern repeated across the Atlantic throughout May. U-209 was sunk on May 5 by escorts using torpex-filled Hedgehog mortars. U-438 was destroyed on May 6 by aircraft dropping torpex-filled depth bombs. U-89 went down on May 12. U-186 on May 15. U-954 on May 19. Each loss followed the same script: detection by radar or ASDIC, followed by persistent tracking, followed by weapons attacks of unprecedented lethality. The loss of U-954 on May 19 carried particular personal weight for Admiral Donitz. The Type 7C boat, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Odo Loewe, was attacking convoy SC-130 when British escorts HMS Jed and HMS Sennen detected it with ASDIC. The frigates pursued contact with Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars, weapons that fired patterns of 24 small bombs forward while maintaining sonar contact. Unlike conventional depth charges dropped astern, Hedgehog projectiles exploded only on contact with a solid object. When the explosions came, they confirmed hits rather than near misses. U-954 was struck by multiple Hedgehog bombs, each containing 35 pounds of torpex. The combined explosions cracked the pressure hull. The submarine sank in less than 3 minutes at coordinates 54.54 north, 34.19 west. All 47 crew members were killed, including Lieutenant Zursee Peter Donitz, the Admiral's youngest son, serving as watch officer. The loss was reported to Donitz by secure telegraph within hours. U-954 attacked and sunk by British escorts HMS Jed and HMS Sennen. Hedgehog weapons achieved direct hits. No survivors. Your son is gone. Donitz did not pause operations or take leave. There would be time for grief after the war, if Germany survived. For now, his duty was to approximately 40,000 submariners under his command, the living who still depended on his decisions. But the personal loss, combined with the catastrophic operational losses mounting throughout May, weighed on every assessment he made. By May 24, 1943, the operational U-boat force had lost 42 boats during the month, with 1,832 men killed and 183 survivors. Different sources cite slightly varying figures, with some listing 41 combat losses or 43, including boats stricken from service, but regardless of the precise number, the losses represented approximately 25% of operational U-boat strength in less than 4 weeks. The casualty rate was unsustainable. New boats were being commissioned at a rate of approximately 20 per month, but if losses continued at May's pace, the entire operational U-boat force would be destroyed within 4 months regardless of construction rates. More critically, experienced commanders and trained crews were dying faster than training schools could replace them. The youngest generation of officers, men in their early 20s who would have led the force in 1944 and 1945, were drowning in the Atlantic before they could develop the skills that made veteran commanders like Siegmann and Werner so effective. On May 24, 1943, Donitz convened an emergency meeting with his operations staff. The plot board in the operations room at U-boat headquarters told a story more brutal than any statistical analysis. Red pins marking U-boat positions had thinned dramatically across the North Atlantic. Blue pins indicating Allied convoys flowed through areas where wolfpacks should have intercepted them. Black pins, the markers of U-boat losses, clustered in the operational areas where submarines encountered Allied escorts and aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Dönitz drafted the order that effectively conceded defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. To all U-boats at sea, due to superiority of enemy location equipment and overwhelming air coverage, North Atlantic operations are temporarily suspended, effective immediately. All boats currently in the North Atlantic are to withdraw to positions southwest of the Azores. Boats transiting to operational areas are to proceed to Biscay ports. Further operations will await development of improved defensive measures. The immediate statistical impact was dramatic. In June 1943, German U-boats sank only 17 merchant ships in the Atlantic. In July, only 9. The Allied supply line, which had seemed on the verge of being severed in March, became secure. The vast convoys that would support D-Day and the liberation of Europe began assembling in American ports, protected by escorts equipped with weapons whose lethality German submariners had learned to fear but never fully understood. Back in Gdynia, Steinhoff's team continued analyzing the Torpex problem throughout summer and fall of 1943. The working group expanded to include representatives from IG Farben, BASF, and other German chemical firms. Their task was clear but nearly impossible. Replicate Torpex production despite material shortages, Allied bombing of chemical plants, and the rapidly deteriorating strategic situation. Dr. Trautmann led the German effort to synthesize RDX in military useful quantities. His team at IG Farben's Ludwigshafen facility began experimental production in June 1943, using a batch process that required pure nitric acid, formaldehyde, and ammonia. The yields were disappointing. Where Allied continuous flow processes produced RDX with 70 to 80% efficiency, German batch methods achieved only 40 to 50%. Worse, the quality was inconsistent. Some batches contained impurities that made the final Torpex equivalent too sensitive to shock. Others lacked sufficient purity to achieve the desired explosive power. Testing consumed precious materials and time that Germany could not afford to waste. Production scaled up slowly through late 1943 and early 1944, but never reached operationally significant levels. By January 1944, German industry was producing approximately 500 kilograms of RDX per month. This compared to Allied production measured in thousands of tons monthly. The disparity was so severe that German ordnance planners abandoned hope of equipping the entire U-boat force with Torpex-equivalent depth charges. Instead, they reserved the limited RDX production for specialized weapons like torpedo warheads and demolition charges for special forces. The aluminum powder presented another bottleneck. German aluminum production, already stressed by aircraft manufacturing demands, could not spare the quantities required for explosive applications. The powder needed to be extremely fine, with particle sizes measured in microns, to achieve the proper mixture with RDX and TNT. This required specialized milling equipment that was vulnerable to Allied bombing. Several aluminum plants were destroyed in summer and fall 1943 during the combined bomber offensive. Production capacity declined just as demand increased. By early 1944, German ordnance experts were experimenting with magnesium powder as a substitute, but the results were disappointing. Magnesium burned hotter than aluminum, but produced less sustained pressure pulse in underwater explosions. The German effort to counter Torpex ultimately failed, not from lack of scientific understanding, but from industrial incapacity. German chemists understood the formulation. German engineers could build production facilities, but Germany lacked the industrial resources, the secure manufacturing base, and the time necessary to match Allied production at meaningful scale. The window of opportunity, if it ever existed, had closed by mid-1943. Meanwhile, German U-boat crews continued sailing into combat, equipped with depth charges filled with conventional TNT-based explosives, knowing they faced enemies armed with torpex. The psychological impact was corrosive. Submarine crews had always understood they faced dangerous missions, but they had believed their equipment was at least comparable to Allied weapons. The discovery that Allied depth charges were fundamentally more powerful destroyed this assumption. Feldwebel Wolfgang Hirschfeld, senior radio operator aboard U-109 through 1942 and later serving on U-234, recorded the demoralization in his secret diary, written in real time during patrols. By late 1943, we knew the Allies had better radar, better sonar, more aircraft, more ships. Now we learned they even had better explosives. Every aspect of the technological competition had turned against us. We were fighting with obsolete weapons against enemies who possessed superior equipment in every category. The human cost mounted relentlessly. In September 1942, approximately 3,000 U-boat men were at sea in operational boats. By August 1944, 28,000 of the 40,000 men who had served in the U-boat force were dead. The survival rate fell below 30%. Every patrol became a near-certain death sentence. Yet the Kriegsmarine continued sending boats to sea, crewed increasingly by teenagers with minimal training, commanded by officers who had survived 1 or 2 patrols rather than the dozen or more that characterized experienced commanders. The institutional knowledge that had made the U-boat force so effective in 1941 and 1942 was dying in the Atlantic, dragged to the ocean floor in steel hulls crushed by torpex-filled weapons. Herbert Werner, promoted to command U-415 inches April 1944, experienced the futility firsthand during what would be his final war patrol. The boat departed La Pallice on April 10th, assigned to patrol the western approaches to the English Channel in anticipation of the Allied invasion that everyone knew was imminent. The mission was nearly suicidal from inception. The English Channel was shallow, restricting submarine maneuverability. Allied air supremacy was absolute. Surface escorts numbered in the hundreds. Within 24 hours of reaching the patrol area, U-415 was detected by an RAF Liberator equipped with centimetric radar and depth bombs filled with torpex. The aircraft dropped 4 bombs in a perfect straddle pattern. One detonated within 15 feet of the submarine's stern, close enough that the explosion cracked a stern torpedo tube and jammed the rudder. Werner crash-dived, taking the boat to 250 meters, despite the damaged rudder, making depth control extremely difficult. For 16 hours, U-415 crept through the depths while escorts hunted overhead, their ASDIC pings echoing through the damaged hull like funeral bells. When Werner finally brought the boat to the surface under cover of darkness, he discovered the damage was too severe for field repair. U-415 limped back to France, mission aborted, crew traumatized. The boat never made another war patrol. It was destroyed in its bunker at Toulon by an Allied air attack in July 1944. Werner survived only because he was ashore when the bombs fell. Of the approximately 1,180 U-boats commissioned during World War II, 785 were lost. 30,000 submariners died, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any military service on either side of the conflict. The majority of these losses occurred after May 1943, after Allied sonar and radar systems matured, and after torpex-filled depth charges became standard throughout Allied anti-submarine forces. The explosive chemistry discovered in British laboratories and produced in American factories had combined with detection technology to create an anti-submarine system against which German submarines had no effective defense. The post-war accounting revealed the scale of Allied explosive production, with numbers that explained why German efforts to match torpex failed so completely. The Holston Ordnance Works in Tennessee alone produced over 400 million pounds of RDX during the war years, approximately 180,000 metric tons. This single American facility produced more explosive than all German chemical plants combined, managed during the entire war. British production added another substantial quantity. The Royal Gunpowder Factory at Waltham Abbey, the original torpex development site, produced tens of thousands of tons. Additional British facilities at Bishopton, Scotland, and other locations contributed more. Combined British and American production exceeded 500,000 metric tons of RDX-based explosives. German production, by comparison, totaled approximately 5,000 metric tons across all RDX formulations. The ratio was roughly 100-1 in favour of the Allies. This industrial disparity, more than any tactical innovation or strategic decision, determined the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. Germany simply could not compete in explosive production against opponents whose industrial capacity dwarfed their own. The technological lesson transcended the specific narrative of depth charges and explosives. The examination of the captured Torpex depth bomb in April 1943 revealed to German naval leadership that Allied technological capabilities extended beyond what intelligence had estimated. If the British and Americans could develop and mass-produce revolutionary explosives while simultaneously fighting a global war, what other technological surprises might they deploy? This psychological effect, the destruction of confident certainty about competitive parity, influenced German defensive preparations across multiple domains. Intelligence assessments became more cautious, always assuming enemies possessed weapons beyond current German knowledge. Resources were diverted to countermeasure programs that arrived too late. The revelation that Allied explosives were fundamentally superior accelerated the demoralization that infected German military culture in the war's final years. For the German submarine crews who survived the war, the memory of Torpex attacks remained among their most persistent nightmares. In post-war interviews, memoirs, and historical conferences, veterans consistently described the increased lethality of depth charge attacks after spring 1943. They had experienced explosions that seemed to reach further, cause more damage, crack pressure hulls at greater distances than their training had prepared them to expect. Few understood until after the war that the explanation was chemical rather than tactical. The weapons hunting them had become more powerful, not through better aim or larger size, but through revolutionary explosive formulation that German industry could not match. Werner, who immigrated to the United States in 1957 and became an American citizen, spent his later years working as a consultant on marine engineering and underwater acoustics. The irony was not lost on him. He was helping improve anti-submarine technologies for the nation whose weapons had nearly killed him dozens of times during the war. In lectures at the Naval War College and the Submarine School, Werner would occasionally discuss the technological factors that defeated Germany's U-boat force. We were fighting enemies who possessed superior detection equipment, superior industrial capacity, and superior explosive chemistry, he told one audience in the 1980s. German submariners were brave, skilled, and determined, but courage cannot overcome explosives that are 50% more powerful than your own weapons. Skill cannot compensate when the enemy can produce 100 times more ammunition than your factories can manufacture. Determination means nothing when the technological gap is too wide to bridge through training or tactics alone. The statistical evidence and technological analysis both pointed to the same conclusion. Torpex had contributed significantly to turning the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. While no single technology determined the outcome, the combination of improved sonar, centimetric radar, increased numbers of escorts and aircraft, and more powerful explosives created an anti-submarine system that German U-boats could not survive. The cavity magnetron, which enabled radar to see through darkness and weather, has received extensive historical attention. Torpex, the explosive that made every Allied depth charge 1/3 more lethal, has been studied less thoroughly despite its profound impact. Together, these technologies, combined with Allied industrial supremacy and cryptographic advantages, defeated Germany's submarine campaign decisively by mid-1943. The examination in the Gdynia testing facility in April 1943 had been diagnostic, but came too late to alter outcomes. By the time German scientists understood what Torpex was and how it worked, Allied production had scaled to levels that made German replication efforts futile. The revelation explained U-boat losses but provided no path to preventing future losses. It was knowledge that brought understanding without offering hope. In the end, the story of German engineers discovering Torpex represents one of many instances where technological surprise shaped World War II's outcome. Like the examination of the Rotterdam magnetron, like the encounter with Allied sonar, the Torpex discovery demonstrated how rapidly military technology could shift strategic balance when one side possessed both superior science and superior industrial capacity to exploit it. For the 40,000 men who served in German U-boats, technological inferiority meant more than tactical defeat. It meant sailing into combat knowing your weapons were inferior, your defensive equipment obsolete, your survival dependent primarily on luck rather than skill. The sound of depth charges exploding nearby, closer than safety margins predicted, became the acoustic signature of that inferiority. And for the 30,000 submariners who died in those steel coffins scattered across the Atlantic floor, many were killed by explosive forces they never understood. Torpex charges that reached further and struck harder than the TNT weapons their training had prepared them to evade. They died not because they lacked courage or competence, but because chemistry and industry had turned against them in ways that no amount of bravery could overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.